This meeting is being recorded.
Gotta wait for all those disclosures to pop up. Well, good afternoon. My name is Kristian Damkier. I'm one of the engineers here working at the Sac Metro Air District. I work in the grants and incentives world, specifically with on-road mobile sources, which include cars, trucks, trains, locomotives, all sorts of anything that moves and has an engine we look at. Thank you to Nicole and the PEV DAC committee for the opportunity to talk about some stuff this afternoon. Like she said, I just wanted to give a brief overview of kind of where we're at and some recommendations for specifically disadvantaged community applications, and then really just open it up towards the end that we can just have an open discussion about how we can, make these disadvantaged community applications advantaged and when it comes to applying for grants. The next slide. So for 2022, we're reaching an inflection point, and basically, for the last couple of years, the demand for funding has exceeded the supply, pretty substantially. So we've got a lot more money because of that, and that is a good thing and a challenging thing at the same time. The exact details of the application period and the specific requirements are still under development, and we're working hard to figure out what's going on, but we do know there are some things that we can talk about now that will help applicants make their way through the process. As in the past, a lot of the funding is going to be targeted specifically to improve disadvantaged communities. Not only is this the right thing to do, it's also what the legislature wants us to do. And because of this, potential applicants, especially in the disadvantaged communities, can get an advantage if you start preparing now. Next slide. So this is from the governor's proposed budget for the next fiscal year. So this is state money that's going to be distributed for zero emission vehicle investments. As you can see, this is about $10 billion worth of funding. It is over several years, but the scale of this investment has not been seen, I don't think, in any of our recent history. So a lot of the things you can see there are programs that we've been working with for a long time. Clean vehicle rebates, Clean Cars for All, the ZEV infrastructure grants, targeting passenger vehicles, light duty. There's also now the proposal for an equitable at-home charging. I don't know the specific details of that program as of yet, but I'm assuming that it's probably going to be targeting disadvantaged communities and how to get at-home charging into low-income and potentially multifamily housing environments. The big ZEVs, the big projects we typically have focused on. Drayage trucks are a huge focus. Those are port trucks that go in and out of the ports of LA, West Sacramento, Oakland, any of the ports in California. There are substantial investments also proposed for transit buses and school buses, and we're well poised to take advantage of those projects due to our involvement with the transit agencies and the school districts. There's additional funding that they're going to be doing for some other specialty projects. As you can see, there's consumer awareness, manufacturing grants. Emerging opportunities is something that's going to be interesting, just sort of a catch-all category for some innovative projects. So that's what's going on the state side. Again, this is a proposed budget. The final budget is still under development, so we'll see what happens. Next slide. So here's where we're looking at for federal funding. There's a lot of federal funding coming out for as part of the infrastructure package that was passed last year. There are infrastructure grants going straight to the states to pay for vehicle infrastructure charging stations. There's also community charging grants, rural grants, corridor charging, and then standard programs like the low-no clean school buses, And there's also some stuff about ferries and even a battery recycling program. All very exciting stuff, but as you can see, the federal dollars are almost twice as much as just the state of California. So the state funding is really going to be the lion's share of our opportunities for this next cycle. Next slide. So again, 10 billion in new state funds for ZEV vehicles and infrastructure, 18 billion in federal funding. That's for the entire United States. Other state funding that is of consequence is going to be the Volkswagen mitigation program and the Carl Moyer program, which is a little over $500 million for the next year. This funding is probably going to filter out slowly over the next 2 to 3 years through various state local programs, but applications are going to come sooner than later, and we need to prepare for that. Next slide. So when you're preparing for your vehicle applications, it's never too early to start. What you really need to do is focus on what kind of vehicles you need. Are you looking for cars? Are you looking for light trucks, large trucks, buses, shuttle vans? What's the needs that your organization has? And specifically, what type of range are you needing for your vehicles? Once you've identified what your vehicle needs are, that's the time to start talking to the dealers to start designing and pricing the equipment. And this stuff should be done before the application period even opens, because often once the application period opens, the dealers are deluged with requests from all sorts of agencies and may not get back to you in time. And rather than rushing to catch up, if you can lead the pack, your application probably stands a better chance of being funded. In addition to that, a lot of the funding programs do require some level of historic usage and ownership with the application. So it's a good time to go through your shoeboxes and file cabinets, if we still have them. Hopefully everybody's digital with your Excel spreadsheets and stuff now, so you can just print out reports. But sometimes it does take a while to track down vehicle titles and maintenance records from 2019 or something like that. And one of the critical things to follow up on is setting a timeline that's realistic for your project. We have experienced many delays in pretty much every phase of the project, including delays in approvals, both internally and externally, manufacturing at every level. Supply chain issues are a way of life right now. There's no end in sight, unfortunately. So delays, delays, delays. And the inevitable delays in funding. Even when approved, sometimes there's a lag between when a project is approved and when you can actually invoice and pay for the project. Next slide. Some of the best practices I recommend: plan for both your COVID and post-COVID needs. It's probably not a good way to say post-COVID, depending on how you see the virus going, but we have different needs right now, but as we return to more normal activities, your needs may change as well. So rather than just buying vehicles here and there piecemeal, we really recommend a purchasing plan that extends over a full life cycle of the vehicles, like a 5 to 10 year strategy. One thing is also to keep in mind, plan based on the vehicles that are existing today. There's a lot of talk about what vehicles may be coming down the pipeline or what may be available, but for these applications, the people are really looking for existing technology, off-the-shelf vehicles available today. Prepare for challenges. We've experienced challenges of many types with the vehicles: maintenance, downtime, other unknowns. A lot of this stuff is brand new technology, so the local dealer network may or may not be familiar with it. And finally, it's really helpful to build that coalition, working with your drivers, working with the maintenance facility staff, to build that group that can address these things. And it may require reaching out to other divisions or other sections of your organization to build that consensus before someone just forces the technology onto an unwilling partner. Next slide. So for infrastructure, it's a different set of issues. One of the big challenges you face is whether or not you want to start with AC or DC charging. The chargers have kind of separated themselves into two technologies based on the type of current that's used, alternating current, direct current. AC charging is what most people are sort of familiar with. It's a standard overnight charger. People have them installed in their house, or maybe there's some older chargers at your work, or maybe a school or something like that. They're typically lower power. They're designed to charge the vehicle slowly over many hours. The newer ones are the DC charging, where the electricity is put directly into the vehicle battery. Those are capable of very fast charging. And because of that, there's a whole different section of utility requirements that are necessary to handle that kind of power. Because of that, we highly encourage working with both your utility and electricians as early as possible to determine what site requirements you have. Depending on how many vehicles that you have or you want, and the type of charging that you want, the site requirements could be vastly different depending on those circumstances. Additionally, all the applications for our incentive programs do require a lot of detailed cost quotes, and that does include anything that's being done to the site in terms of trenching, paving, stormwater upgrades. There's all sorts of things that happen when these new installations go in, transformer upgrades, utility side and customer side, and then the actual cost of the charging equipment itself. And again, set a timeline that's realistic. There's a lot of delays in approvals, manufacturing, funding, and that can also include any sort of permitting or issues with a potential landlord. Next slide. So for infrastructure, we've identified some best practices that you can follow to help make your application easier and more competitive. Part of it is you need to do long-term planning for what your infrastructure is going to be. This is a major change to your property, and it's just as important as building a new building or putting in a new playground or upgrading your sewer system. That's the level we're looking at. You need to determine the parking locations, where the vehicle is going to be parked. You need to find out where the utilities are. Where does the power come into your site? If you can site your parking locations near where the utilities come in, it might save you some money. However, you also have to future-proof, because if you are going to be having a large installation with trucks and vehicles and employee parking, you're going to have some very challenging design work ahead of you. Site work by far is the most expensive component. Labor is extremely expensive right now and probably will not go down. And we're just also running into issues with supply issues and stuff. So when you tear up concrete, you want to do it once. And we've been recommending that you overbuild. It's a lot easier to say, I can only do 2 or 3 chargers right now, but if I build a network for 20 chargers and just put a stub out, a little hole in the ground, a little concrete stub waiting for a future charger, it won't necessarily add that much more to the project, but it will make it so much cheaper in the future to do the expansions. So work with your utilities, especially to plan out your future needs, because the sizing of your transformer and the existing power supply in the neighborhood may come into effect. If you're looking at just a couple of shuttle vans, depending on your charging, could be the equivalent of several hundred homes being added to the grid, and SMUD may have some real restrictions on what's possible without having to spend millions of dollars to upgrade the grid. But that said, it's also an opportunity to plan to potentially put light duty charging into your commercial plans or commercial charging into your light duty plans, and to be very creative, because as you work with your electrician and utility, if you plan now, you may be able to increase the cost of the project 20 to 30%, but it will save you millions of dollars in the future. And that extra site work may be eligible for incentive dollars today. Next slide. So the reason I want to talk to you guys right now is specifically how we can help disadvantaged communities compete for and get this funding, especially here in the Sacramento region. We want to make sure that we're a player and we can compete for these very complicated programs that are coming out. One of the leg ups is that a lot of these programs do receive preference if they are based in a DAC. What we mean by that is that for infrastructure projects, the charger itself has to be in a disadvantaged community. For vehicles, it's typically where the vehicles are registered or parked. So we just need to know that kind of information. Right now, the state is transitioning from CalEnviroScreen 3.0 to 4.0. There are some small changes between which communities are there, so recommend checking both. It's also a good idea to work with the business owners and landlords early in the process. You want to make sure that before you commit to doing a project, everybody's on board. And I've had several projects that have delays because somebody in the process was unable to get permission from a landlord or some sort of a planning organization. So make sure you understand the needs of your property before you apply. One thing that we're all concerned with is the availability of staff and resources to help in the planning and applying for these processes. We locally try and make the process as easy as possible. However, we know that there are times we've got competing resources. So I don't really have a solution for this, but I want you guys to start thinking about how to make this easier, because it is an issue that keeps coming up in terms of helping disadvantaged communities access the funding in the first place. And one final note for the disadvantaged communities, unfortunately, these are areas that are sort of blighted. They've been neglected over the years. So the infrastructure in those communities is often older, and it does require more time and cost specifically to support these high power ZEVs. So once you go unlocking that utility vault and checking the transformers and the lines, there may be some surprises that we find. So keep those in mind when you're trying to help out the disadvantaged community applications. Next slide. And finally, just touch on some other issues related to land use and infrastructure. In a lot of cases, this infrastructure construction does require compliance with CEQA and various zoning requirements. We've run into many issues on this in terms of preparing CEQA documents. Even if you're going for an exemption, you still do have to file paperwork and work with your jurisdictions. Zoning can be an issue. We've run into issues where everyone's on board, but the city has decided that there's not any new zoning for that, or that the zoning has changed for that property, so you can't add any additional fueling infrastructure, or there may be additional zoning requirements that people are not aware of. And that's why in general, we want to make sure that the plans complement or enhance the existing or future land use of the property. So that way, when we work with all the stakeholders and the jurisdictions, everybody knows that what we're trying to do is improve the community, as opposed to putting something in that would be a controversial or negative to the area. And that's why siting infrastructure on the property is important. You want to make sure that it's sited in a good spot. And part of this is you need to think in a broader regional perspective, that your charger, your station, your stuff may become part of a regional network. And if we start looking at transportation networks and advanced mobility option and even autonomous vehicles, there's going to be a lot more discussion on how we can incorporate all of this great zero emission vehicle and infrastructure planning to build off of each other to really support a transition to a zero emission future. So with that, I think next slide, we'll just open it up to any discussion and keep it informal. If we can bounce back and forth if anybody had any questions. We can go from there.
Thank you, Kristian. It looks like Shiloh has a question.
Thanks, Nicole. Hey, Kristian, great presentation. Curious about, you'd referenced DAC as it's aligned to Cal EnviroScreen. Just curious if that's DAC SB 535 or if that's measured by high scores, say red zones within Cal EnviroScreen. I'm just curious how you're defining that for the purposes of these opportunities.
I'm defining it however our grant defines it. And typically it is done by the Air Resources Board, taking that, I guess, the top 25%, quote unquote, worst. I don't like that term, but
yeah,
it's the highest score in there. And they come out with those. So that's the definition that I use. But again, the definition can change depending on what the grant is.
Okay, thank you.
Dwight McCurdy left a comment in the chat. Will SMA QMD staff be able to advise nonprofits on which funding sources will best apply to their situation?
Potentially. You know, a lot of it is just the availability of staff resources. You know, that's why we encourage people to develop the projects early on. And then, you know, once you have a project that's fully fleshed out, we can then try and help you find the funding, but it does require the project to sort of be shovel ready, the better use of the term, before we can really tell you what funding is available.
I see Tim, you raised your hand. Do you have a comment or a question too?
I wanted to, it's a little bit of a combination of comment and question, and that is, I think Kristian did a fantastic job covering this, and he especially covered the issues associated with infrastructure and planning. But I wanted to sort of, I guess, reiterate, once you get past a few vehicles, the planning is really important, and sometimes there's a benefit, if possible, in using an entity that has a lot of experience with planning. This isn't Clean Cities. We really don't have the level of experience that some folks would need. But you can get in, it can be a very significant amount of work to do the planning associated with a site. Once you get past a few vehicles, the number of complications that we've seen fleets run into have been just amazing. So even to have, I mean, not just having the right amount of power or even the right kind of power that's in the vicinity can be a problem in addition to everything else that Kristian mentioned. So sometimes I know that's an expense and maybe people don't have the funding for the expense, but doing that work on your own can be tough. You should look for checklists and things of all the different areas to be trying to get information and figure these things out. I just wanted to mention that. And as Kristian mentioned, you need to plan for overbuilding early on. And the few that you get, the few vehicles that you get now won't be the total number that you get in the end. So planning for that long term is really critical.
Thanks, Tim. And I kind of want to add to that. With the Racial Equity Task Force, you know, we had the goal of coming up with a toolkit that's aimed basically at scoring projects for their adoption into the DAC subcommittee, which, you know, we have the hopes of having, you know, resources such as, you know, maybe different organizations that do specialize in planning and implementation, or like Dwight's question, you know, maybe we'll have resources that will help advise. Uh-oh, sorry, my daughter is out here with me. But maybe we'll have entities also that will help, you know, point some of these projects that, you know, applied to be part of the DAC subcommittee, what funding was best for them. And so, you know, based off of Kristian's presentation, there's a lot of funding coming in, both state and federally. And so a goal of this DAC subcommittee, and I'm sorry if I'm cutting in and out, the goal is to, you know, set up these projects for success, and, you know, not only success to getting funding, but also helping them through, you know, once they've got funding and, you know, their next steps. You know, one of our questions in the criteria, I believe, is asking if the proposed project needs help with permits. So we really set this toolkit up to, you know, help these projects succeed. And I'll ask, you know, Tyrone or Gina, if they want to add anything to that.
Yes, Nicole. Let me just say, I'm excited about the prospects here. I wanted to make a presentation perhaps at our next meeting. I've been doing a lot of research for some of the other Office of Equity and Racial Justice around the country. I've focused on Seattle, Portland, Elk Grove, certainly Sacramento, San Antonio, and I had a tremendous positive one in San Diego. I was really encouraged. I looked at their plan, which they've been out. It seems to start in 2015, but the model that we are attempting here on our Racial Equity Committee is exactly what they've done there as well. In fact, they created a community fund, and ironically, they put $3 million in there. So having said that, I was like, whoa, we are right on point. And I look forward to, I'm in the process of connecting with that office, and I look forward to them perhaps making a presentation, their creation and some of their experiences, best practices, if you will, regarding that. So I just want to drop that out there. It's pretty exciting.
Yeah, that's really exciting, Tyrone. Especially since like what we've been doing these last few months is aligning with what other communities and cities are doing. Shiloh, did you have another comment or question?
Nope, I probably just kept my hand up. Apologies.
That's all right. Does anyone else have any questions, either for the DAC or for Kristian?
Nicole, this is Jaime. Just a thought. I don't know, you know, it's not something that the SAC Metro District can solve, and it's not something that some of the funding, at least within the CARB incentive funds or grant funds, is there's an opportunity here. But one of the things that I've been just kind of thinking a lot about is how do we get past upfront capital costs, you know, because a lot of these incentives are reimbursement based. And so, you know, if there's a nonprofit or a community organization that doesn't have a lot of capital, then how do they take advantage of that, right? And so it's just something that I see as a barrier. It's something that I talk to legislators about. You know, I get a nod and say, you know, they agree, but there's no solutions for it, and that's just kind of frustrating. So I just wanted to put that out there too. Maybe, you know, I don't know. I'm not asking for a solution, but just something that we should all think about.
Yeah, and I agree. That's a huge barrier and limitation for a lot of the projects that, you know, have great ideas, but then they have no like landing to kind of take off from. So, but hopefully, you know, things will change, especially as like more cities are starting to adopt equity plans and divvying out those funds.
Nicole, let me make certain that that's a question that we will present if we're able to get a presentation from San Diego Equity Office.
Yeah, I think that's a great thing to keep to make aware of. Thank you, Jaime. Any other comments, related to funding or anything that you want Kristian to maybe go back over? We do have about 20 minutes left in the meeting. Make sure.
I have a comment. Kristian, I understand that there is an ask in all of this presentation, and the intent of it is for all of the organizations in the region to collaborate, but the ask of bringing projects forth, is that something that you'd like to talk about?
Well, yeah, I mean, part of it is our agency and the state and stuff like that. We really can't develop the projects ourselves. We have to respond to the community. And, part of it, that's a good thing. We want the community to develop their own needs and stuff, but it does create an issue of, chicken and the egg. It's, in order for us to fund applications, we need applications. And that's sort of the intent of me presenting here, is saying the money is going to be available this year and next year. If the community wants the money, we do need to start thinking about this, and infrastructure projects especially take a long time to plan out. And it is one of those, okay, we want to put a fast charger, a vehicle charger at a community center in South Sacramento. What's the process for that? First you got to talk to the community center to see if that's a good thing. Then you got to work with the landlord to see what kind of improvements and agreements need to be made to put something on the property. Then you got to talk to SMUD to see what's going to be the cost of providing electricity to that. But before you can talk to SMUD, you have to work with an electrician to price out the equipment. And all that stuff has to be done before the application is turned in. And it's unfortunate on our end, from a funding agency, we often, even with a 30, 60, 90 day timeline for submitting applications, that's not enough time to develop these projects. So applicants who wait until the funding plans are released often find themselves too little too late when we're competing against other interests across the state that already have their ducks in a row. So, and that's kind of where we're going into a leap of faith argument here, is that we do need to start developing these projects before the funding is secured, as a way to secure the funding for the region. And as Jaime pointed out, as I pointed out, that comes out as an expense. And I'm sensitive to that concern myself, but it is one of those, if we start the discussions now, maybe that can lead to some good partnerships, and we can identify resources and stuff now, so that later this year, when the funding is available, we're much stronger position.
Thanks, Kristian. So it looks like there's two questions, either for Kristian or maybe the DAC. What level of interest is there in the employee workplace charging? And his second question is, how much interest is there in the installation of EV charging stations in low-income single-family housing versus multifamily housing?
Well, employee workplace charging is something that is a challenge to think about right now, just because of what the shape of employee charging is going to be in the future. Pre-COVID, workplace charging was kind of dropping off because employers started charging for the electricity, and the vehicles themselves have long ranges. You don't necessarily have to charge at work anymore. So most employees were charging at home, where it was much cheaper. so demand went down. Now that you're looking at COVID, a lot of employees are not returning to the office on a regular basis. So you just don't have as many employees in the building at any specific time. So your needs have changed dramatically. But there still may be some. We still see, especially essential worker places like healthcare facilities, schools, educational facilities are still doing a lot of in-person. So there could be some need there. In terms of the installation at low-income multifamily housing, I think as on the budget slide, it showed that they're throwing some money at that this year, as they've needed to for many years, because we're severely lacking charging at multifamily housing and facilities where serve the low-income communities. And in order to build that equity in terms of making sure everyone has access to zero-emission vehicle technology, that is a strong interest. And quite frankly, I think developing those applications should be a priority for the PEV DAC committee, specifically multifamily housing in disadvantaged communities in Sacramento. I think there's a good nexus to support. I think SMUD's interested in that as well. And there's a good amount of funding, and it does support a lot of our district efforts in terms of clean cars for all, car share deployment. So I think that one specifically is looking at it. And new construction, I think, yeah, anytime we can build a project with EV, that's great. Part of it is just knowing when a project is coming into play. And, obviously other timelines come into effect. You've got bond sales, you've got deadlines in construction. And if there is the opportunity to sprinkle a little pixie dust here and there and add a couple of vehicle chargers to a project that's being developed, that would be great. But at the same time, I think, I don't want to neglect our built out communities as well. I don't necessarily want to only focus on the new construction, because what is it? I've heard the term that 80% of the houses that will exist in 2050 already are built. So you think about the future, and the future is going to be mostly the same buildings that we have today. So we really do need to focus on those as-built areas. And there are a lot of communities like on Mac Road and along Del Paso Boulevard and stuff that we really need to focus on those areas so that they don't get lost in the shuffle.
I just wanted to ask a quick clarifying question. The funding that's coming to be available, either state or federal, that can be used for existing projects, or is it only for like new developments and whatnot?
To the best of my knowledge, I think there's no distinction between new and existing construction. I don't think any funding sources I'm aware of have a distinction. The costs would be different, obviously, but I'm not aware of any distinctions. This 100% charging in new construction. It's a good discussion on the new construction. I think, part of the hope would be that, maybe at some point the cities and counties mandate EV chargers as part of new construction, so that the people building the new projects are the ones paying for the projects. There's kind of a good nexus, and it's a lot simpler that way. But again, it does drive up the cost of new construction, and there's a lot of issues associated with that in terms of housing supply, and anything that makes it harder to bring more housing online can be a challenge, because we do have a housing crisis in the region that we need to address. So I think for the time being, we need to sort of work in hand saying, how can we do a carrot and a stick approach, where we have the carrot of incentive dollars, but also a stick of sort of a mandate as to why to do these projects. So it's complicated, and that's sort of why I included in there that we need to start talking about this stuff now in terms of how we can roll out that. And if it does need to be that, you know, you start mandating that these new projects have the ability to have EV chargers in anticipation of funding being available for the chargers, that's a good thing. But at the same time, I don't want to focus too much on the new construction, because there's going to be a lot of people in existing units that need these chargers as well. So that's going to be a bigger challenge in my mind, in terms of bringing equity to the table.
Nicole, maybe one more comment.
Yeah.
The other thing that we've been learning as we were working with the city of Sacramento and the electrification ordinance is, as we look at the built environment, so all the stock that's already up and going and the infrastructure, in order to even think about putting EVSC in a lot of those either private residences or multifamily dwellings, the panels, you know, are just old, and that's another thing that needs to get addressed. So before we even consider, you know, the electrification of charging or even, you know, appliances or anything like that within the built environment, there's a lot of work that needs to get done, and I have not seen any type of grant or incentives or funding for that type of work. So yeah, that's another challenge.
Yeah, that's true. There's a lot of there is a lot of issues just with some of the reports that I've written that you know, there's the interest to get, you know, an electric vehicle, especially at like multifamily dwellings, but then there's no, you know, the panel, there's delays in that because the panel needs to be updated, and you know, that has to go through like the housing agency and everything. So you know, if the funding that does become available can kind of be tailored to break down those like barriers and those challenges for people, because it's not even just like the individual, you know, it's the utility district that can't, you know, go forth either. So there's a lot of challenges to it.
Nicole, Kristian, I wanted to ask a question in terms of the current technology, because as I hear about the various barriers that we're going to meet in terms of going into existing homes. So maybe could you just give me a quick, give us a quick snippet of where they are? I mean, I'm just envisioning, you know, from just a vision viewpoint of it, you install a electric charger on your wall, and so now you can plug it into your electric vehicle. So where we are in terms of the technology on that?
How many hours do we have left? No, it's
one. We have 4 minutes.
4 minutes. No, it's so many challenges. I think one of the biggest challenges I see in a lot of neighborhoods is the existing use of the garage, quite frankly. You know, you have houses where people don't park their cars in their garage. You know, so when we think of, you know, I have an EV and I park my EV in my garage, and I was able to put an electric circuit and have a nice system installed. But what if you don't park in your garage? What if you have to park on the street? There's stuff like that. The state of technology is better. All EVs come with a special charger that can plug into any household outlet. It's really slow, but it actually can provide a decent charging. And I've seen people using extension cords to charge in their driveway or on the street. We do need to sort of address that from a code and safety issue. That's a bit of a problem. I don't really want to have high voltage extension cords going over sidewalks. That's not safe for children and stuff like that. But it's a very good challenge. And I've seen some places where they install a vehicle charger on the outside of the house. That might be something to look at as well. They have weatherproof installations, and the circuitry may be easier, and it might be a more convenient location so that you can charge vehicles on your driveway. You know, those are some good options. The technology is getting much better in terms of being able to tie in, but you know, it's sort of, I personally see the technology now is moving towards what they call vehicle to building, which is where your vehicle could charge your house. And I really personally like the idea of having chargers so that during power outages or emergency times, the owners of the house or the occupants can power their CPAP machines. They can keep the lights on. They can have their stuff going from their car. And I think that's a value added proposition to a lot of this discussion. So it's really trying to figure out that last mile state of addressing those technology issues so that we can create a really innovative world.
So again, thanks, Kristian. I think in my head, I'm trying to envision a presentation to a community, family, husband and wife. Here's the future. Here's a prospect of, we're trying to go into the new electric world, and we have some kind of the device, the panels, the kinds of things that we're talking about presenting to them, and they can grasp it. That's really what I was asking about, the technology, where we are with that.
Yeah, and I think that's a good opportunity. It sounds like we've got a hard stop here at 3,
Yeah.
but anytime we can get the community to actually touch and interact with the technology, that's a good thing.
Yeah. Thank you,
Thanks, Kristian.
Kristian, for leading this discussion and presenting on this. I left some emails, my email and Kristian, if anyone has questions. And I just want to thank everyone sorry, I just see another announcement. But yeah, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. And we look forward to, getting more funding into our DACs. So thank you, everyone.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Bye all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.